You are now tuning in to the Going North podcast with your host, best-selling author and professional speaker and member of the John Maxwell team, Dominic Dom Brightman. And every Monday and Thursday, we're going to hear the voice of a different author sharing their gifts, stories, and expertise to help you charge forward in life. Now let's get on with the show. And today on the Going North podcast, we bring you some extraordinary humans from across the globe. Today is no different because we have another TEDx speaker in the house. And not just another TEDx speaker, but also a best-selling author who is a freaking genius that has put his pen to paper and put out a super special, awesome book for you to learn from. For those who are fans of John Maxwell and his 15 Laws of Growth, if you read his book, this is one book you want to add as another book to supplement that, because that book goes to laws, but this book teaches you how to actually learn at an ultra rapid rate to advance yourself at a more rapid level. And this guy right here, he undertakes interesting self-education projects such as learning MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum in 12 months. 12 months, y'all. This man knows how to condense a lot of education into small bits to make yourself the best human ever. Your BHE. And for those who've been living under 17 rocks, you probably don't know who I'm talking about. But for those who read the title, you know who this is. It's the one, the only Scott H. Young. How are you today, sir?
I'm great. Great to be here. I love that introduction.
Oh, yeah, man. Usually gotta have some icing on the cake before the dad jokes start.
That's good. That's good.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, no matter how good introductions are, they're always missing one thing or another. So mind filling in some cavities where missing fillings?
Yeah. So I just published a book in August of 2019, which is when you were maybe listening to this a little bit later. But the book is called Ultralearning, and basically it documents people who have done some pretty interesting and sometimes incredible learning projects where they have gotten good at something that they care about in a way that often doesn't involve going to school, or often involves doing something a little bit unconventional, maybe even a little bit intense. And so in the book, I talk about people like Benny Lewis, who knows 10 plus languages, and he has gotten proficient in languages in as little as 3 months, or people like Tristan Montebello, who with near zero public speaking experience became a finalist for the World Championship of Public Speaking in just 7 months. And along the way, I talk about a few of my own projects, like you mentioned, my MIT challenge, which was to try to learn MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum by passing the final exams and doing the programming projects. But instead of going to school, instead of going to MIT and trying to get the degree, I used the free resources they provide online. So instead of taking 4 years, I did it over 12 months. And instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, it cost me a little less than $2,000. And other projects I've done involve learning 4 languages in 1 year. With a friend, we did a project we called The Year Without English, where we went and learned Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, Chinese, and Korean through the process of just fully immersing ourselves when we were traveling. And so, yeah, I'm happy to talk to you and your listeners today about how they can learn better and get better at the things that they care about.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I was listening to the audio version of the book, and I was just amazed at that whole 1 year of no English and the amount of commitment it took just to be able to stick with that.
Mhm. The interesting thing about it is that when I talk about it, so I'll just recap it briefly for those of you who are listening are like, wait, what's this? So this was a friend and I did a project where we went to 4 different countries. We went to Spain, Brazil, China, and South Korea to learn the languages in each of those places. And the kind of conceit of the project, or idea of the project, was that we had what we called a no English rule. So that meant that when we landed, we wouldn't speak in English to each other or to anyone that we would meet. So any person that we met in those countries, barring some sort of rare exceptions, we were only speaking the language that we wanted to learn. So this kind of full immersion process think most people already know that immersion works well for learning a language. But I think the interesting thing is that this process of learning a language is actually, I think, easier than a lot of people give it credit for. And I know this because you were talking about doing TEDx talks. So my friend and I did a TEDx talk about this project and about sort of this approach to learning languages. And I was joking to my friend before we went on a stage. I was like, you know what, we're gonna like advise people to do this. And this is funny because it's something that I really feel deep down in my bones that, like, if you want to learn another language, doing some version of this is probably your best option. This is the way to do it. But at the same time, I was saying this to him. I was like, you know what? Most people are going to be like, no, I'm not going to do that. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because this process for learning the language, in my opinion, is actually a lot easier than the approach most people take, which is you sit in classes for years without having a conversation with someone. You play with your on your phone for months and months and months and months. You're getting lots of little gemstones and points on your app, but you're not actually able to have meaningful interactions with people. And so I feel for a lot of people, they have in their head this idea that, well, I couldn't learn a language, or I couldn't learn some hard skill like math or programming or physics or what have you. And they have these ideas in their head, often because the way they've approached it in the past hasn't been very effective. And so particularly with language learning, I feel that if people did try some version of the approach that we took, you would actually be able to get to a point where you can have meaningful interactions with people that you couldn't have done in English much, much earlier than you would be thinking possible. And indeed, when we were doing this trip in each of the countries we're in, we were making friends, we were going on dates, we were socializing. We were really living a life that we couldn't have done if we had only been speaking in English in the time. And so I think that this approach to learning languages is underrated, but I think as a kind of general strategy for learning, it's underrated for learning all things.
Yeah, you're definitely right about that. And what really amazed me about that is the fact that it's so gutsy, it takes courage, but it also makes perfect sense because even though you can sit in the class for years and lose all that time and you learn a bunch of phrases, you might learn some stuff that the folks at home, their home, they may not even use that as much anymore. Kind of like with different parts of America. Yeah, it's one country, all have English, but there's different di dialects of English. It's kinda like Baltimore. It's like a lot of Baltimoreans don't use the T in Baltimore, they say Baltimore. It's like if you're in certain parts of Asia, they may say something totally
Yeah.
different, and you learn a lot quicker by failing fast and getting that feedback instantly.
Yeah, and I think part of it is just that when people think about learning a language and really learning a lot of skills, they think about it as a kind of academic exercise, that their sort of experience of learning languages, okay, well, you sit in a class and then someone gives you some words to memorize and maybe you do some like little drills to, conjugate grammar or whatever it is. And they forget that the whole point of learning a language is to communicate with people. And so if you want to get better at that skill, you ought to actually communicate with people. And I think that in some ways that's actually easier than the task of learning things in school, because if you've ever tried learning Spanish in school, for instance, they make a big deal out of like masculine and feminine and conjugating things correctly. My friend, when we were in Spain, did not conjugate things correctly probably for about a month, and he was still having conversations with people and interacting. He was just saying it wrong the whole time. And it was like, it was one point, I think we were eating dinner and I was like, okay, no, like you have to stop doing this. You've been here for a month now. You actually have to know how to conjugate things properly. And so he did learn. But I think that would surprise a lot of people from the kind of academic way of learning things, because in their head, well, in order to make friends and have conversations and like get things done, like you go to a store and you ask for something and they understand you and they get it for you, or you go to a restaurant, or you're having conversations, like there's communication happening here. The idea that you wouldn't be able to do basic conjugation, which is kind of like a pretty early on exercise if you were in a Spanish classroom, is kind of surprising. But at the same time, how many people in a Spanish classroom, if you ask them to go into an actual speaking situation, they freeze up, they're stumbling, they forget all the words. And so I think this approach to learning things, it really focuses you on what is necessary for communicating. And sometimes that's not going to take you towards perfection in the beginning, but it's going to force you to learn these are the things exactly that you need to learn to be able to communicate with people. And so even if you can't travel, even if you can't do the no English rule for your entire life, you can do it in more limited ways. So you could, let's say, have a spouse or a roommate and decide, okay, I'm going to go know English just with this person and we're going to both practice this language. Or I'm going to spend an hour a day and do it this way. Or even just half an hour a week with a tutor that you meet online. Like, it doesn't have to be as extreme. What matters is that you're actually learning through communicating with people and not just by writing with a pencil and paper, doing some grammar exercises is the only form of practice you're doing.
There you go. There you go, right there, indeed. There you go, indeed. Because writing is great, but it's
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think, and this is a sort of a general principle that I talk about in the book, which is I call directness. And it's based on, really, there's been over 100 years of studies of psychology showing that when we learn things, it's difficult for us to transfer it from the situation that we learned it into a new situation. That there's study after study showing that if you teach someone one type of skill, they often don't generalize it to another skill. So, you teach someone something in a class and then you get them in a real life situation and they just fail to use the things that we thought that they had learned correctly when they were in the classroom environment. And so, because of these difficulties with transfer, if you want to learn things successfully, that you actually care about doing them well, whether that's learning another language like we've been talking about, or whether it's a career skill, or whether it's public speaking, or whether it's leadership, or whether it's whatever you're talking about, it's very important to think, when you start the project of learning a new skill, to think about what are the situations where I'm actually going to be using it, and then do at least some practice in a situation that is quite similar to that. So if your goal is to become good at public speaking, therefore, you need to actually do some public speaking. You can't just read a bunch of books on communication and study it. You actually have to get up and speak in front of people. If you want to program your own startup website, then you should learn the kind of programming that you would do for a small project for startup websites, and not just take some generic computer science class.
yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And the beautiful thing about it is it kind of lines with the follow-up principle of don't dodge the punches. It's something that we're all really kind of scared of in a way.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Well, feedback is so often the thing that prevents us from really doing what we know we ought to do when we're learning things. And so very often we come up with these sort of elaborate rationales for why we're not ready to do something that involves getting feedback. And very often this is just an excuse. This is just a way of avoiding maybe something that might be a little scary or a little uncomfortable. And so, I mean, we were talking about speaking a language. This approach of learning through sort of immersive situations, I think for most people it makes sense. I don't think there's very many people who are hearing this and thinking this is crazy. Like, the reason that people don't do it is because it feels much more comfortable to sit passively in a classroom or play on Duolingo on your phone than to say, okay, for an hour, even if I have to use Google Translate 98% of the time, I'm going to try to have an interaction with someone. That's scary. That's difficult. And because it's difficult, we would prefer to substitute it for something else, maybe something that doesn't have that much feedback or isn't that similar to the activity we're doing. And so I think this idea that I'm trying to put forth in this book of ultra learning is that it is possible to learn a lot of skills more effectively than we're used to, or than our sort of naive experience of going through school would indicate. But at the same time, the reason that this approach to learning is not as common is because it is harder. It does require a little bit more guts, a little bit more courage, and a little bit more determination, to be honest, that I really want to learn this skill and I'm not just here to fritter away time.
There you go. And I know you're big on time because I know you mentioned the whole Pomodoro technique and then also
Mhm.
some others where you actually, from the get go, for those who may not be at the point where you are, where you've kind of like mastered, I guess, in a way, time management of actually timing
Mhm.
your exact activities. But with all of your like amassed knowledge right now, is there a specific skill that's like next on your list to try to learn next, or something that you're really trying to do or tackle?
Oh yeah. So there's a lot of skills that I'm keen on learning. And there's some that I'm kind of learning right now, even though I'm not doing kind of big projects about them. So I'm currently doing some oil painting and I'm also learning some machine learning and a few other things. But one of the skills that has really interested me, not because it's a new skill, but precisely the opposite, because it's been a skill that I've been doing for a long time, is writing itself. And the reason I'm interested in it is that a lot of the learning projects I've done have been focused on learning something where to get good at it is very very concrete and well defined. So to get better at a language, it doesn't take much looking around to see what is involved in getting good at a language. It's pretty easy to tell when someone speaks a language better than someone else. And similarly with, passing a class or learning a programming language, these are fairly concrete, specific types of skills. Whereas writing, particularly when you've already done it for a long time, as I have, is sort of an interesting kind of example because most people wouldn't really know exactly what you need to do to get good at writing. And so this is something that has interested me because I think that for a lot of us, we kind of avoid thinking of the goals that we have as learning projects because if you say to yourself, well, I need to get really good at marketing in my business, or I need to really get good at leadership, in my management role, or I need to get good at, some other kind of skill like that, it's often not clear where to start. It's often not clear how you get better or how you even know that you've gotten better. And so I find that very interesting because although the same rules and principles for learning still apply to these skills as much as they do for an algebra class, the process is often a little murkier. And so that's sort of one of the sort of next frontiers that I'm really working on is seeing if there's not some systematic way to think about these kinds of skills that often defy, easy measurements and scorekeeping.
That's right, scorekeeping indeed. And I guess in a way with the writing, I guess with that, you could probably use your blog and just query your listeners and not just listeners, but also readers. Because I know, yeah, do podcasts
Yeah,
too and all
yeah.
the other good stuff.
Yeah, so that's one thing to do is to get feedback. And I mean, I have been doing that. I've been writing on my blog for over the last 13 years. There's probably over 1,300 articles there now. And so with the volume of stuff that I've written, it is definitely the case that, I've gotten a lot of feedback and I have improved my writing over the last decade doing that. So it's not to say that I haven't been working on it. And I'm glad that, this book has been fairly well received. And I think in part of that is because of all the work I've done over the last decade in improving my writing ability. And so I think to get further, to really get to a new level of not just sort of being good, but really mastering a skill, I think that's very interesting. And I think, that was one of the things that I touched on in the later part of my book, talking about Vincent van Gogh, because to be an excellent painter is not merely to be good at painting. It's also about producing something that's just totally unique and totally creative and something that no one's ever seen before, and that's what really captures people's attention. And so the process of learning again is similar, but it also changes when you're not trying to just learn something someone else is teaching, but you're trying to learn something that no one else has ever seen before. And so I think learning in those domains is also kind of an interesting skill because there aren't going to be any classes that teach you to be an elite level painter just because you have to produce something that isn't paint by numbers. It isn't something that someone else has done before.
Amen to that, because it's great to try to duplicate a bit in the beginning, but after a while, you got to find your own style of doing something in a way.
Mhm.
And I guess that kind of
Absolutely.
really, I guess that comes in the way from like the eighth principle of intuition. I guess intuitively, you kind of find your own way or your own style in a way after a while of doing something.
Yeah, and I think the more you learn in a particular subject, the more choice there is, the more options you have about what to do next. And sometimes those options can feel somewhat overwhelming. It can feel somewhat overwhelming to be like, well, how the heck do I get better at marketing? And then people will say, like, is there a book I can get? And they're probably, if you've been doing it for a while, I mean, if this isn't the first time you've ever tried to do any marketing, there probably isn't one book that you can get. There's probably 100 books, and there's probably 100 different little skills you can work on. You get a little better at your copywriting. You get a little bit better at interviewing customers and listening to them. You get a little bit better at promotion or design or timing, or there's all these little factors that go into being successful as a marketer. Similarly, there's a lot of factors that go into being successful as a writer. There's storytelling, there's research, there's the words you use, the language that you're choosing, there's creating vivid pictures. So there's all these little skills that are themselves little projects that you could take on to improve. And so I think if you're first learning a skill, in some ways it's easier because if you've never done any writing before, you could just pick up some book off the shelf that is like a step-by-step writing course, and then you just write 50 to 100 articles, and you're like, okay, I've got a good sense of how to write now, at least the basics. Whereas if you've been writing for a long time, or if you've been working on a skill for a long time, then mastery itself becomes a challenge.
Ah, yeah, definitely. And I guess that just revolves, I guess, in a way of change because you gotta really like focus on like certain aspects and kind of like the storytelling itself. You're definitely right about that. Well, pun unintended on that one, but with the whole writing thing, like that's something. Heck, even me personally, I need to work on myself in a way, and it's great. Do you think there may be a way to possibly do that? I guess in a way, like maybe talking with folks who have written books, I guess, kind of like a Stephen King in a way, or maybe learning from them in a way of like maybe extremely fast listening to audio versions of some of their material.
Well, I think that if we're using the example of writing, for instance, then if you want to be a great writer, you have to read a lot. You have to consume other people's writing. And most of the people who are kind of elite level creative performers in any field, they consume a lot of the same kind of stuff that they create. And so I think it's very difficult to perform at that level if you don't also consume other people's work. I mean, there are some exceptions where someone is not a consumer of the thing that they are very good at producing, but usually that's just because they're doing something where the other things that exist at that time aren't the best comparison to what they're trying to work on. And so if you want to be a great writer, if you want to be a great podcaster, marketer, leader, speaker, whatever you are trying to do in life, if you work on trying to study people who are people that you respect, people that you admire, you can learn a lot of things. And so, even for me, when I was writing this book, I spent a lot of time looking at what are some books that I like that I think I'm going to try to emulate some of their style, and how are they doing it? What are they doing well? So, not only people who wrote books that are kind of in a similar genre, like one of the big inspirations for me writing this book was the way that my friend Cal Newport structured his book Deep Work. That was sort of like a kind of a guidance for how to structure the book early on, but then also books that are in completely different genres. So I really like how, J.K. Rowling writes Harry Potter novels. I think there's a lot to be learned there from writing nonfiction for how she's able to pull you through, a 600-page children's novel. Like if you can get 12-year-old girls to read 600 pages over a weekend, you know something about how to make compelling writing. And so I think that this study of people who are better than you, not even so much like, you mentioned Stephen King. Stephen King is someone who's written about writing, so you can obviously get his advice on writing. But even if the person that you admire hasn't written about, what they think about their craft, you can still study them, see what they're doing, and try to understand that. And that's a little different than just being a passive consumer. If you were wanting to start an amazing podcast, you could figure out what are the podcast episodes you like, and what do you like about what the interviewer's doing, and which kinds of guests they have on, and where they take the interview with the guests, and that kind of thing.
Heck yeah, man. That's right. Emulate the great at an ultra rapid rate. That's right, indeed. Get that ultra learning on. Well, looks like coming close to the clock. With all the mass knowledge and experience, a question I like to ask every guest, and you probably don't have to go too far for this one. That's basically if you were to wake up tomorrow and you're 25 again in the current year of 2019 with your new found weapon of ultra learning, what advice would you give to yourself?
Oh, you know what? I think because I really got started doing these things around when I was 25, so it's sort of funny that we're using that as the benchmark. Because I think that I would probably Well, no, I did a lot of these projects around when I was 25. So I think that the thing that I would probably advise myself back then is to do projects like these, because I think that for so many of us, we stick to the script that we've been given in life. And whether that's going to school, whether that's getting the, whatever job and working really hard. And for many of us, we work really hard at the script that we've been given. So if someone tells us that it's okay to do X, then we're okay to work really hard on it. But I think in some ways that's kind of counterproductive, because working really, really hard on the same script everyone else is working hard on means that you're competing against someone else that's also working really hard. And so I think sometimes what we need to do is pursue projects, pursue ventures, pursue ideas that are not on the script, that they're not what other people are telling us to do, but we have an interest in them and we have some passion for doing them. And they can often take us to unusual places that you wouldn't have gotten to just by grinding out the same life script that everyone's living. So I think that's probably what I would suggest to my 25-year-old self.
And that's what I call magical right there. If life gives you a script, just smack it out of its hand and create your own. Well, for those who want to stay young and keep up in contact with you and all the wonderful stuff that you're doing, what's the best way for folks to reach out to you?
Yeah, so you can check out my website, which is at scotthyoung.com. That's SCOTTHYOUNG.com. And there, as I've mentioned earlier, I have over 1,300 articles on goal setting, productivity, of course, learning habits, all these kinds of topics. And so you can get there, and I even have a free chapter of the book that we were discussing as well. If you want to check out the book is called Ultralearning, Master Hard Skills, Outsmart the Competition, and Accelerate Your Career. And it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books. And as we were talking as well, it's also available on Audible. So if you're not sick of hearing my voice, you can listen to the audio version.
That's right, baby. That's right. Because, got a lot of folks who don't want to pick up a book nowadays. So go on ahead, pick up the book if you like reading, pick up the audio if you don't like reading or don't want to make the time to read. Heck, buy both. Buy some copies for your friends and your family because it's some good stuff.
Thanks. Thank
That's
you.
right. If you had a Thanksgiving table full of books, this is definitely one that needs to be on that table.
Thank you.
Well, all righty. For any parting words for the folks still listening?
Yeah, so I think the thing that I would like to leave people with is just that the possibilities you have to learn something that you care about are a lot broader and more varied than you realize right now. And so if you felt stuck in your life, in your career, in the things that you even do for fun, your hobbies, I suggest checking out the book because there are a lot of ideas there that will help you get past some of the things that maybe you're struggling with right now.
Hey there, you superstar. Thanks a bunch for making it this far in the podcast. Hope you really enjoyed it. Heck, if you made it this far, that means you really enjoyed it. Be sure to shoot the guest an email or head over to the social media pages and leave them a nice response that you heard them on the Going North podcast so that way they can continue to be inspired to do great things. And be sure to share this podcast with others that you think would enjoy it as well, because we want to inspire as many people as possible to live their dreams, embrace them, and to do something positive.